Someone has to leave first. This is a very old story. There is no other version of this story. Frieren Beyond Journey's End is a tale that starts where most end. After a 10-year journey to defeat the Demon King with her 3 companions, we first meet Frieren, our main character, on her travels back from what may have been the most significant adventure yet. However, to Frieren, it was a mere 10 years, barely a fraction of a total lifespan. As an elf who is likely to live for thousands of years, she is unable to fully celebrate with her companions. She is unable to appreciate that moment of seeing the beauty in the world she helped free, because to her it feels so limited. Her lifespan will far exceed that of her friends, so by comparison, her experiences seem ephemeral. To her, a 50-year wait for a view of a once-in-a-lifetime experience is no issue. There is always a later for Frieren. And as if to emphasize this point, the first episode of the anime passes through 50 years of the characters' lives, a final moment shared together, and the death of one of Frieren's friends, Himmel, all within the span of 17 minutes. We watch as the dirt piles up on the coffin, and Frieren unearths the memories she thought as so insignificant before. To her surprise, she cries. Frieren Beyond Journey's End, in part, is a story about grief. Grief is a fairly common theme in narratives, spanning as far back as fairy tales, which Frieren, the series, takes some inspiration from. Generally, grief acts as an oppositional force, something that a character needs to overcome in order to grow as a person or to restore some semblance of peace in their lives. It sounds quite simple when I put it that way, but I don't mean to minimise the difficulties inherent in that. Working through grief often involves working through some heavy and arduous emotions relating to a loss. You don't emerge from grief unchanged in some way. We find grief narratives mostly in dramas and the like to add emotional depth to a storyline, but one genre I think's particularly interesting when it comes to grief is horror. Horror, I think, is especially effective at dealing with grief as a theme because of its ability to elicit a strong and unpleasant emotion in its audience, usually fear or disgust. Grief, like fear, feels like an unwelcome and disruptive entity in our lives of which we can, at the very least initially, feel powerless in dealing with. Horror stories, likewise, have some kind of monster or monstrous entity that at first seems incomprehensible and is eventually overcome by the main character. This is significant because it usually symbolises the end of the hardship, or at least a major aspect of it. When done well, the monster or the horrifying experiences of the characters can feel visceral. They can make you question, through the characters, your own relationship to reality. This is not too dissimilar to how grief can completely disorientate how you function on a day-to-day basis. This is why it's all the more cathartic when the monster is overcome or dealt with. Horror can provide us with this kind of safe space. It can let us have these feelings of fear or grief and simulate them, and simulate us overcoming them in some way. Somehow it says these problems can be solved. But Frieren isn't really like that at all. It has little to no horror elements or motifs, and instead opts to be a fairly light-hearted fantasy story with some shades of slice of life. Instead of giving us terrifying or even unnatural visuals or even a general sense of unease throughout, Frieren offers instead calming, meditative sequences of nature, verging something you might expect in a Studio Ghibli film. Sure, this generally tranquil mood of the story is punctuated often with fight scenes and interpersonal conflict. There are monsters in the form of demons, but I wouldn't really argue that they're to symbolise Frieren's grief or any particular feelings she wants to overcome. I mean, she does tell one to kill herself at one point, but defeating demons isn't something that's driving the story so much as it's just one of the many tasks Frieren happens to pick up along the way. Frieren, both the show and the character, isn't exactly plaintive for the most part either. You would be forgiven for believing that this isn't really that concerned about resolving anything too deep. Its slow pacing and multiple deviations it takes from the plot kind of tells you that it's not really worried about dealing with something that important. With horror, or really any story that deals with grief, the structure of the narrative can help offer something of a scaffolding to our experiences, something for us to project onto and try and make sense of the experiences we're going through. But Frieren doesn't really provide this either. For Frieren, life continues much as it did before for the last decade or so, alone and somewhat content with that. So, why should we speak of grief? Does Frieren have anything to tell us about grief? As stoic as Frieren seems as a character, she is not completely unaffected by the death of Himmel, or indeed any of the passings of the other characters. And despite the comments of other characters, I don't really think of her as particularly emotionless or unsympathetic. I think to understand Frieren, both the character and the show, what it says about grief, we need to re-examine how we define it. We need to think about how it actually affects us. Likely, you'll be familiar with what's called the Kubler-Ross model of grief, also known as the 5 stages of grief. This is the idea that we progress through a certain number of emotions following a loss before being able to get over it. Usually, these emotions include shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. Though some professionals include other emotions, and some may not even prescribe a particular order to them either. However, having actually read the book that this varies from, I think it is worth noting that the author doesn't actually argue for grief to be processed in this way. On Death and Dying, the book that it's from, it actually just discusses emotions that the clinician noticed that her patients would go through when they confront their death. And then he later noted that the bereaved also go through similar emotions as well. Kubler-Ross's work was then co-opted, essentially, by other prominent psychologists at the time, psychoanalysts especially, who determined that grief should, in theory, be progressed through in a linear fashion, and that doing this is the healthiest way to do it. This idea of how grief should be dealt with has kind of stuck in public consciousness since. It's coloured the way we think about it and how we think it should be experienced. Although, in reality, we don't always get such a simple path forward. Grief is notorious for being hard to grasp and define, somewhat paradoxical given that we will all at some point go through it. When Frieren starts to cry at Himmel's funeral, she says,
"In all truthfulness, I hardly knew anything about him. 10 years with him wasn't nearly enough time to learn. Why didn't I try to better know and understand you?"
Frieren doesn't feel shock or anger when confronting Himmel's death. Frieren feels regret. But regret's a funny thing to feel after someone dies, isn't it? How can you get to know someone who's no longer there after all? Logically, we know that someone is gone after they die. Someone always leaves first, and for Frieren, she has adapted, I think, to knowing that it's always going to be the other person who leaves. Yet, Himmel lingers in her mind. The feelings linger still. There are other ways of dealing with grief. For some, it's some kind of belief in the afterlife, a convenient idea as one of the characters' heightened notes, in order to get through life's hardships, to imagine there's a far-off place that you'll go to once it's all over. But for those who still feel a kind of presence of the departed, I believe, albeit subtly, Frieren's story suggests something different, that we can still have a continuing bond with those we have lost, that our lives are still impacted by those who have left, even when their story is over and yours continues. This is not the same as some kind of hallucination of the dead. In fact, I think the series makes this distinction itself in the 5th episode, wherein Frieren must defeat an actual phantom, one that takes the form of a deceased person using its victim's memories, and this is something she's able to defeat with ease. A continuing bond with a deceased person is not the same as death denial, nor is it merely reminiscing on what that person was like before they died either, though this can certainly be part of it too. A continuing bond, put simply, is to feel some type of enduring connection to someone after they died, kind of living legacy of a person and how they continue to impact your growth. More of a moving together with than a moving on from someone. When viewed from this perspective, I think both Frieren as a character and the show's somewhat comforting tone makes a lot more sense. Frieren's grief and regret isn't distressing, but it's explored in several ways that feel both dynamic and intuitively understandable to the viewer. Grief, or at least the continuing bonds theory, does not have to be a wholly negative experience, especially if you're able to integrate it constructively with your present life. I understand that this may sound kind of a weird way of formulating grief, again, because it's generally a problem in the narrative. It's generally a problem for people in life. Perhaps it even sounds too idealistic, depending on your own experiences. I do think it's important to note that Frieren, whilst very obviously inspired by European fantasy in terms of its aesthetics and character tropes, it was still written by a Japanese writer. Now, generally speaking, even if you don't intend to when you write, usually the values and the morals of the culture you come from will be implicated somehow into the things you write. It goes without saying, but like all people from all cultures around the world, not all Japanese people hold on to these beliefs. Not one experience of grief is the same after all. When you take into consideration these cultural concepts, however, the way death is dealt with in an almost understated way in the series begins to make a bit more sense. Admittedly, topics like Shintoism and Buddhism and the history of it in Japan is far outside the scope of what I'm capable of discussing here. But one relevant traditional Japanese concept I thought was worth mentioning here is Sosen Suhai, which roughly translates to a deep respect or veneration towards one's ancestors. Generally, this entailed a number of ritualized practices performed by the living to the dead, including keeping and maintaining an altar at the home to the ancestors called the Butsudan. Taking care of it and even talking to it can be a part of everyday life. The reason I mention these things is because quite frequently we see Frieren come across these statues of past heroes, but several of these are of Himmel as well. She usually is tasked with cleaning one of them up as one of her many side quests. In one of the earlier episodes, Frieren goes as far as to find a specific kind of flower that Himmel mentioned to her once, a kind of flower that only grew in his hometown and that he wanted to show her but never got the chance to. What's also quite interesting is that when she's asked whether her search is for Himmel's sake, she denies it and says it's for her own. There is both this idea of carrying out someone else's will, which is actually quite a common sentiment in grief, but also that it is a fulfilling an old promise, and that this in some way is good for Frieren as well. Her repertoire of magic has expanded, and she finally understood what he meant when he said that they were beautiful. Through new experiences, she deepens her understanding of him and herself. She learns more about him even though he's not physically there with her anymore. Just like one may choose to talk to a loved one or share news at their grave, Frieren's actions to his memory are seen as rewarding and worthwhile despite the time and effort it takes. We can be influenced to act in a way they would have despite their absence. For example, in her second chance to see a sunrise of a New Year's Day, Frieren decides to make the effort to wake up on time, begrudgingly. Remembering the last time she missed it, Himmel expressed disappointment. Though she claims it was nothing special, she does find value in the experience ultimately through seeing the look of wonder in the eyes of her apprentice, Vern. It is through her past connection with Himmel that she is able to deepen her connections with her present companions. Introduction, meaning to take on the characteristics of another person you are influenced by, is also another feature of this. There are many instances where Frieren acts in a way towards others as Himmel once acted towards her, such as when she held Fern's hand when she fell ill. Another example of this is when she tells another companion, Sign, don't dwell on the past when you have the present, to encourage him. These are the exact same words that Himmel told her at the start of their journey together. The point here, I think, is that our connections, both past and present, help shape who we are. Frieren, the show, also makes frequent use of flashback sequences to convey this kind of melding of the past journey and the present day one. Scenes of the present are spliced to show what happened in the same place at a different time so that we, as the audience, get a sense of how Frieren is re-experiencing her memories in real time. Furthermore, I think this editorial technique works to show not only the past informing the present, but the opposite. The present adventure is also recontextualized Frieren's relationship with Himmel, who I think we are to understand she views as important to her without explicitly understanding in what way. Himmel, on the other hand, well, I think it's apparent early on that he loved Frieren the best he could, despite the fact that he also knew he'd never be able to share his life with her. The idea of eternal love crops up quite often when talking about grief, and I think it's relevant here. Himmel attempts to bridge the gulf between their lifespans by having many statues commissioned of them, so that the future Frieren won't feel lonely. It is a gesture she won't know the full intention of until he's already died, so he has to trust that she will understand even when he's not around to see it. Objects left behind by the deceased can also be imbued with meaning in a similar way. In a favourite episode of many, Frieren loses a ring she was gifted by Himmel, one of many gifts we are told, so it holds no particular significance to her. However, through a series of events, we and Frieren learn that the ring was engraved with a flower symbolising eternal love, something we are all but certain Himmel knew the meaning of when he gifted it. What was once considered a mundane object to Frieren has become a token of her evolving understanding of who Himmel was to her. And so too do various objects of our own lives. Things that once seemed to be so ordinary and trivial can become imbued with a person's presence once they are gone. Like a favourite book you never got around to reading, or a worn album, or a receipt from the last place you went together. These two can be precious gifts. As the chapters go on, Frieren's journey does start to devolve into more of a typical shonen anime, with the flashbacks becoming more restricted and somewhat predictable, usually near the end of the episode or the adventure of the day. This too could be said to be an accurate portrayal of someone's experiences of grief. Life for Frieren, as mentioned before, goes on regardless, and the memories experienced become more episodic. This is much like how one may feel a kind of presence of someone at certain times, but not always, not consistently. Memory too is subject to change, and with it too does the way we relate to our past. In the present time of the story, Himmel is known first and foremost as a hero, who had changed many lives of those he came across on his travels. An archetype almost, an idea to aspire to. The Himmel we get to know through Frieren, however, was surprisingly vain and could at times be quite sarcastic and even melancholy. Himmel made mistakes, a hero only after the fact. But the present has no room for embarrassing stories, and our memories can deteriorate. In one episode, Frieren catches up with a dwarf friend, another race that is long-lived, though not the same extent as Frieren's is. Vol, the dwarf, acts to protect the village where he and his wife lived. His wife was a human, and they lived very long ago. It matters to him that he keeps his word to his wife, but she's no longer there, and he even admits to Frieren that he can't even remember her voice or her face anymore. Despite our best intentions to carry our memories into the future, forgetting and a fear of forgetting are near universal aspects of grief too. Being forgotten may be inevitable, but does that mean we shouldn't try to be remembered anyway? If I'm honest, I'm not sure if Frieren's story is one of holding on or letting go when it comes to grief. Or rather, I think neither position's really prescriptive in how grief should be dealt with. I think for most people, there will be times where you will need to let go of some aspects of how life used to be before the person's departure, and there will be aspects of that person's just way of being that's going to persist anyway, whether that's through memory or through an ongoing presence. And it isn't to say I question the wisdom inherent in letting go or having to let go sometimes. Sometimes it is the best and most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. I think what I'm trying to say is that we will all fall somewhere along this spectrum, and there can all be valid ways to approach grief. Frieren's ultimate destination, for now at least, is to go to Aurelie, where she is told she will be able to speak with Himmel's spirit. She is told that it will help with the regret she has, though I wonder if that will be what she's feeling when she finally arrives. Maybe regret is what Frieren needs to let go of. Maybe that is the end goal to the journey, but regardless of how Frieren ends, and despite how all stories end, I think Frieren, in terms of its pacing, structure, the motifs and the characters, reminds us there is still or was a life to live regardless. There's a scene I wanted to share with you. It takes place much later in the manga, but please don't worry, I won't spoil anything too major. In this flashback, Frieren recounts her time when she was an apprentice, remarking how she feels calm when she remembers her long-gone master. She feels calm despite having previously tried to avoid going to that memory at all. Our world, as well as Frieren's, is ever-changing, and it's too tempting to just use this idea of moving on as a way of not having to emotionally deal with that sense of impermanence. Gently, however, I think this story says that yes, there is an end, but gives us space into taking our time and remembering the journey anyway. Emil turns to her and says, "It's alright to remember Frieren."